When a rookie-age quarterback looks at the most powerful sports league in America and calmly says no, it doesn't just turn heads, it creates discomfort. Because that word isn't supposed to exist in this part of the system. Not here, not this early, not from someone who hasn't taken a single NFL snap yet. And yet, that's exactly what happened when Shedeur Sanders declined what was widely reported as a standard multi-million-dollar NFL starting point. Not out of spite, not to make a scene, but because the offer itself represented something bigger than money. It represented a model that assumes young athletes should be grateful before they're powerful, compliant before they're confident, and silent before they're wealthy. For decades, the league has operated on an unspoken rule. The platform is the prize. Get drafted, sign the deal, keep your head down, and if everything goes right, you'll earn real leverage later. That structure worked when players had no other options, when visibility flowed through one gate, when saying no meant disappearing. But Shedeur grew up in a different reality. One where audience comes before contracts, where influence can be built before permission, where value isn't discovered by institutions, it's demonstrated directly to the public. So when that offer landed, it didn't look like security, it looked like a delay tactic. This is where the narrative gets twisted. People want to frame this as defiance, ego, or entitlement, but that framing misses the point entirely. This wasn't about rejecting football, it was about rejecting the timing of control. It was a calculated pause, not a tantrum, a recognition that leverage only matters when you're willing to use it. And Shedeur didn't say no loudly. He didn't have to. The reaction did that for him. Because the moment word surfaced that he had alternatives, real ones, the system started to feel exposed. What made this moment so uncomfortable for the NFL isn't just the decision itself, it's who made it. A quarterback, a legacy name, a player with numbers, visibility, and cultural weight, someone the league is used to welcoming on its terms. Instead, Shedeur approached it like a negotiation that had already started years earlier. Every NIL deal, every social post, every branding move leading up to this moment wasn't random, it was infrastructure. So when reports surfaced about him locking in a massive Nike partnership around the same time, it didn't feel like coincidence, it felt like leverage being converted into freedom. And freedom is the one thing professional leagues have always struggled to give, because control depends on scarcity, on the belief that the league is the only place where value is created. But Shedeur's move challenged that belief head-on. If a player can delay entry, decline the script, and still secure generational security through private alignment, then the league's role shifts from gatekeeper to option. And options change everything, especially for rookies who were never meant to have them. This is why the conversation around dollar figures misses the deeper issue. The reported money isn't the threat, the posture is. The confidence to evaluate an offer without fear, the willingness to walk away from good enough when better exists elsewhere. That mindset doesn't just disrupt one contract, it disrupts an entire ecosystem built on urgency and dependency. Because once one athlete shows that the first offer isn't final, every future offer starts to look negotiable. So this isn't the story of a quarterback turning down a check, it's the story of a system being challenged by someone who understood it too well to play along blindly. The NFL didn't get rejected, its assumptions did, and that's what made this simple word, no, echo so loudly. Because once it was said out loud, everyone realized it could be said again.
The rookie pay system was built for a world that doesn't exist anymore. A world where athletes entered the league invisible, dependent, and desperate, where the draft wasn't just an opportunity, it was the opportunity. The entire structure assumes one thing above all else, that the league controls access to value. You come in when they tell you to, you get paid what they decide, and if you want more, you wait. That's not a glitch in the system, that's the system working exactly as intended. For years, the logic was simple and brutally effective. Rookies don't have leverage because they don't have proof. No professional stats, no platform, no independent income. So the league steps in early, caps their earnings, locks them into a scale, and sells the idea that patience equals professionalism. Take less now, earn more later. Prove yourself, stay healthy, stay quiet. Then, if the stars align, you'll get rewarded. That promise kept the entire machine running because players had no real alternative. But that model only works if rookies arrive empty-handed, and that's where everything breaks down. The system was never designed for athletes who already have audiences, already have money, already understand branding, and already know what their presence is worth outside the field. It wasn't built for someone walking in with options, because options remove urgency, and urgency is the league's greatest leverage tool. What NIL did, quietly and permanently, was strip away that urgency. It allowed athletes to start monetizing attention before contracts ever came into play. Not hypothetically, actually, directly, real checks, real partnerships, real ownership conversations happening years earlier than the league ever planned for. So when a modern prospect looks at a rookie deal, they aren't seeing a lifeline, they're seeing a comparison, and comparisons invite negotiation. The rookie pay scale also assumes time is on the league's side, that athletes will accept short-term limitations because the long-term upside feels unreachable any other way. But for players who already generate revenue on their own, the waiting game loses its power. If you're already profitable, already visible, already building long-term wealth independently, then wait your turn stops sounding responsible and starts sounding expensive. That's the disconnect. The system still treats rookies like unproven assets, but some of these athletes arrive as proven businesses. They're not just betting on potential, they're tracking metrics, engagement, reach, brand alignment. They understand value creation because they've already done it. So when the league presents a standardized offer and calls it fairness, it clashes with how these players see themselves. Uniformity feels less like protection and more like constraint. And it's important to understand this wasn't a problem until now. The league didn't design the rookie system incorrectly, it designed it for a different generation, one without platforms, without direct access to fans, without the ability to turn attention into income overnight. The rules made sense when players had no fallback, but fallback options change behavior. They create choice, and choice is the one variable the rookie system cannot accommodate without losing control. This is why moments like this feel jarring, not because someone said no, but because the system doesn't know how to respond when they do. There's no clause for independence, no scale for leverage that exists outside the league. The model assumes obedience before autonomy, and when that assumption fails, the whole structure starts to feel fragile. What looks like confidence from the outside is really alignment with reality. The rookie pay system wasn't designed to suppress value out of malice, it was designed to manage risk. But now the risk is flipped. The real danger for the league isn't overpaying rookies, it's underestimating how much power they already bring with them before they ever sign. And once that power is acknowledged, the old rules stop feeling inevitable. They start feeling optional. And that's the point where everything changes. At first glance, the reported offer looked generous. A few $1,000,000 to start your professional career is something most athletes are taught never to question. It sounds like validation, like arrival. But the problem with that framing is that it only focuses on the surface number, and surface numbers are how leverage gets disguised. Because what was presented to Shedeur wasn't really an offer in the way people think about choice. It was an assumption, an opening script the league expected him to follow. The structure of a standard rookie deal is built to feel final, even when it isn't. The money is framed as take it or leave it, not because negotiations are impossible, but because most players can't afford to leave it. For someone without outside income, that contract represents security, rent, family, stability. Saying no feels reckless because the alternative is uncertainty. But Shedeur wasn't standing at the table with uncertainty, he was standing there with options, and that changes how every clause reads. Once you strip away the headline number, what's left is a long list of controls controls over image, over availability, over how and when a player can capitalize on their own story. These deals aren't just about football labor, they're about ownership of narrative during the most valuable years of visibility. That's the real cost, and it's a cost most rookies never see until years later, when they realize how much they gave up by default. So when Shedeur looked at that offer, it didn't register as a reward, it registered as a delay, a pause on autonomy, a trade-off that made sense only if you believed the league was the sole gateway to relevance. But in a world where relevance can be built independently and monetized directly, that trade-off loses its appeal. The offer assumes patience is mandatory. Shedeur saw patience as optional. This is where the misunderstanding happens. Critics frame the decision as turning down money. That's inaccurate. He didn't reject value. He rejected structure. He rejected a deal that undervalued what he already controlled. Because the question wasn't, how much are they paying me? The question was, what does this prevent me from doing next? And once you start asking that question, a lot of so-called good deals start to feel restrictive. It's also important to understand that this wasn't a bluff. Reports of a massive partnership with Nike didn't appear out of nowhere. Those conversations don't happen overnight. They're the result of leverage that existed long before draft talk started. That means when Shedeur said no to the league's framework, he wasn't stepping into risk, he was stepping into alignment with a strategy already in motion. From the league's perspective, that's unsettling, because the system depends on rookies feeling like the first offer is the best offer, that gratitude will override leverage, that fear of missing out will keep negotiations quiet. But Shedeur didn't react emotionally. He evaluated the deal like a business decision and treated it accordingly. That kind of clarity is rare at that stage, and it disrupts more than just one contract. What makes this moment so significant is that nothing about the offer was extreme. That's the point. It was normal, standard, industry approved, and that's exactly why it failed. Anticipate a player who could afford to see the offer as negotiable, not mandatory. Because once a player can walk away calmly, the balance of power shifts instantly. So this wasn't a rejection of the NFL as an institution, it was a rejection of the idea that entry requires submission, of the belief that the first door you're offered is the only one you'll ever get. Shedeur didn't slam the door, he simply didn't walk through it yet. And by doing that, he exposed something the league rarely has to confront, that sometimes the offer isn't really an offer at all, it's a test. And this time, the system didn't get the answer it expected. By the time the league's interest became serious, the machine was already running. That's the part people keep glossing over. Shedeur didn't wake up one morning, see an offer, and suddenly decide to bet on himself. The bet had been placed years earlier. What he built through NIL wasn't a side hustle or a temporary advantage. It was infrastructure, a real ecosystem designed to function with or without league approval. NIL changed the landscape quietly, but its impact was loud if you knew where to look. It allowed athletes to stop thinking like placeholders and start thinking like platforms. Not someday, immediately. Shedeur took that opening and treated it like a business incubator. Every appearance, every post, every partnership wasn't just branding, it was proof of concept. Proof that attention could be converted into income without asking permission from a league office or waiting for a contract to unlock visibility. This is where the traditional evaluation breaks down. Old systems judge players by future potential. NIL rewarded present influence, and Shedeur understood that gap early. He wasn't just leveraging performance, he was leveraging narrative, lifestyle, access, and voice. He learned how to speak directly to an audience, how to move culture in small but measurable ways, how to make relevance compounding instead of seasonal. That kind of skill doesn't disappear just because someone enters a professional league, it grows. What NIL really provided wasn't money, it was leverage literacy. It taught athletes how deals work, how brands think, how value is calculated beyond stats. While some players treated NIL like free cash, Shedeur treated it like a rehearsal for much bigger negotiations. He learned what it meant to align instead of accept, to ask what comes next instead of what pays now. That education is invisible on a highlight reel, but it's everything in a boardroom. So when the league finally did call, it wasn't contacting a blank slate, it was reaching someone who had already tested independence and found it viable. That's a dangerous realization for any institution that relies on being the first and only option. Because NIL flattened the ladder, it removed the sense that this is your one shot. For Shedeur, the league was no longer the beginning of the story, it was a chapter he could choose when to enter. Another thing NIL exposed is how outdated the idea of unproven really is. The league often labels rookies as risks because their professional output hasn't been measured yet. But NIL-era athletes arrive with years of data, engagement numbers, conversion rates, brand performance, audience loyalty. That's real proof, not hypothetical upside. And for someone like Shedeur, that proof existed long before draft projections ever mattered. This is why his decision felt calm instead of dramatic. He wasn't chasing validation, he already had it in forms the league didn't fully control. NIL gave him the freedom to see the bigger picture.
Understand that entering the league early under restrictive terms could actually limit growth instead of accelerating it. That's a complete reversal of how rookies were taught to think for generations. And here's the part that truly shifts the balance. Once an athlete proves they can generate income, attention, and relevance independently, the league stops being the source of value and starts being a multiplier. Multipliers are optional. Powerful, yes, but optional. That's a subtle difference with massive implications, because it means timing becomes a choice, not a necessity. The NIL machine Shedeur built wasn't flashy for the sake of attention. It was deliberate, sustainable, transferable. It didn't depend on wins and losses alone, and because of that, it gave him something rookies were never meant to have before their first contract: time. Time to evaluate, time to negotiate, time to say no without panic. That's why this moment didn't come out of nowhere. It was the logical outcome of preparation meeting opportunity. The league didn't miss its chance because Shedeur rebelled. It encountered a player who had already learned how to operate without it. And once that door opens, it rarely closes again. The conversation shifted the moment Nike entered it, not because of a logo, not because of sneakers, but because of what the deal represented. Up until that point, people could still frame Shedeur's decision as hypothetical, risky, premature, but once reports surfaced that he had secured a major partnership with Nike, the argument collapsed in real time. Suddenly, this wasn't a story about turning something down, it was about choosing something bigger. What made this different from a standard endorsement wasn't just the rumored size of the deal, it was the timing. Nike didn't wait for him to become an NFL quarterback. They didn't need league validation. They weren't buying projected success, they were investing in influence that already existed. That single fact exposed a truth the sports world rarely wants to admit out loud. Leagues don't create value anymore, they amplify it, and amplification is negotiable. Brands like Nike don't move early by accident. They read culture faster than institutions do. They understand where attention is heading before it arrives. So when they aligned with Shedeur at this stage, they weren't betting on touchdowns, they were betting on narrative gravity, on a generation that sees athletes as creators, founders, and voices, not just performers. That reframe is seismic because it removes the league from its historical position as the sole validator of worth. This is where the dollar figure becomes almost irrelevant. Whether the reported number is exact or inflated misses the point. The significance lies in what the deal unlocks: stability without compliance, security without silence, the ability to negotiate future moves without the pressure of needing approval from one institution. That kind of freedom is the nightmare scenario for a system built on early dependency. The Nike deal also changed how credibility was distributed. Traditionally, credibility flows downward: league first, brand second, player last. This flipped it completely. A global brand validated Shedeur independently, which meant the league was no longer the final boss. It was now reacting, not dictating.
That reversal is subtle, but it's powerful, because once brands start treating athletes as standalone ecosystems, the old hierarchy stops functioning the way it used to. There's another layer here that often gets overlooked. Nike doesn't just sign talent, they signal direction. When they commit to someone this early, the rest of the market pays attention. Other brands recalibrate, agents rewrite expectations, young athletes take notes. It's not about copying them.
Move, exactly. It's about understanding what's now possible. And once that possibility is visible, you can't put it back in the box. This is also why criticism intensified after the deal became public. Confidence is tolerated until it's validated externally. Once Nike stepped in, Shedeur's posture stopped being theoretical, it became legitimate. And legitimacy tends to scare people who benefited from the old order, because it proves the system can be bypassed without collapse. That power doesn't come from rebellion, it comes from alignment. Most endorsement deals are accessories to a career. This one functioned like a foundation. It made it clear that entering the league wasn't the only path to scale, that waiting wasn't mandatory, that the athlete didn't need to shrink themselves to fit a timeline that benefited someone else. Nike didn't just support a player, they reinforced a strategy. And that's why everything felt different after this. The discussion stopped being about whether Shedeur was ready, it became about whether the system was. Because once a rookie-aged athlete shows they can secure top-tier partnerships on their own terms, the assumption that they need the league more than the league needs them starts to wobble. And that wobble is exactly what set off alarms behind closed doors. The Nike deal didn't close a door, it opened a new one wide enough for everyone else to see. What really made people uneasy wasn't the visibility or the money, it was the word that started quietly floating through conversations around Shedeur's deals: ownership. That's where admiration turned into anxiety, because endorsements are familiar, they're controllable. A brand pays you to wear something, say something, smile for a campaign, then move on. Ownership is different. Ownership means permanence, it means alignment. It means the athlete isn't just benefiting from the system, they're embedded in it. This is where reports around Shedeur's past NIL arrangements started to matter more than headlines. Deals like the one frequently mentioned with Gatorade weren't just about appearances, they hinted at something deeper. Clauses tied to long-term upside, to brand performance, to shared success. In other words, he wasn't just being paid to promote, he was positioning himself to participate. That shift changes everything, because participation creates leverage that doesn't expire when a contract does. Most athletes are trained to think short-term, cash now, exposure now, maximize while you're visible because the window is small. Ownership thinking flips that entirely. It assumes visibility is renewable and value is compounding. Instead of asking how much can I make this year, it asks what still pays me when the spotlight moves. That's a founder's mindset, not a rookie one, and systems built around control don't love dealing with founders. This is the part leagues struggle with the most, because ownership dissolves dependency. If a player owns equity, royalties, or creative control, they don't need to renegotiate their worth every season. They don't need to beg for relevance. They've secured a stake in something that grows alongside them, sometimes even without them. That independence makes it harder to apply pressure later, and pressure is how institutions traditionally maintain order. For brands, this kind of athlete is incredibly attractive. Someone who thinks long-term protects the brand long-term. Someone who treats a partnership like a shared mission, not a transaction, adds value beyond marketing. That's why co-creation has replaced simple endorsements at the top of the market. Products built with athletes, campaigns shaped by their voice, royalties tied to performance. These aren't perks, they're power-sharing mechanisms, and power sharing is rare in professional sports. From the league's perspective, this sets off alarms because ownership-minded athletes aren't easily replaceable. You can bench a player, you can fine a player, you can trade a player, but you can't easily sideline someone who doesn't rely on you for income, identity, or opportunity. Once an athlete secures ownership outside the league, their relationship with the league becomes elective, not existential. That's why this moment feels heavier than any endorsement announcement. It suggests that Shedeur wasn't just planning for a career, he was planning for life after the career before it even officially began. And that level of foresight disrupts the timeline the system depends on. The league is comfortable with players dreaming about ownership one day. It's far less comfortable when they arrive already executing it. This shift also exposes a deeper contrast. Endorsements keep athletes visible. Ownership keeps them powerful. One is temporary, the other rewires incentives permanently. And when a young athlete starts making moves traditionally reserved for executives and founders, it blurs a line that institutions prefer to keep clear. Players play, brands brand, leagues control. Ownership ignores those boundaries entirely. So when conversations around Shedeur started leaning toward equity, long-term stakes, and creative input, the tone changed. Because now, this wasn't about confidence, it was about capability. About someone understanding how wealth, influence, and narrative intersect and acting on it early. That kind of understanding doesn't fade, it spreads. And that's the real reason people got nervous. Not because one athlete found a workaround, but because ownership isn't a flex, it's a template. And templates, once proven, don't stay exclusive for long. The tone of the conversation shifted the moment Shedeur stopped fitting neatly into the role people were comfortable assigning him. Up until then, confidence was tolerated because it felt aspirational. It was framed as swagger, personality, marketing flair. But once that confidence translated into real leverage, into actual decisions that disrupted expectation, the language changed. Confidence became arrogance. Preparation became entitlement. Independence became a problem. And that shift says far more about the system than it does about him. This is a familiar pattern. Athletes are encouraged to believe in themselves right up until that belief starts affecting outcomes. As long as confidence fuels performance, it's celebrated. Once it fuels choice, it's scrutinized, especially when that choice challenges authority. The moment Shedeur declined to play along quietly, his mindset was no longer read as strategic, it was framed as reckless. That framing isn't accidental, it's how systems protect themselves when power dynamics begin to tilt. What gets labeled as arrogance is often just clarity without apology. Shedeur didn't posture, he didn't campaign, he didn't demand praise. He made a decision based on information, leverage, and long-term thinking. But because that decision bypassed the expected path, it triggered discomfort. People are far more at ease with ambition when it stays within approved lanes. Step outside those lanes, and the same traits get recast as flaws. There's also an unspoken discomfort with youth and certainty. We're conditioned to believe that experience earns authority, that time spent waiting equals wisdom. So when someone young speaks with certainty, especially about value and control, it's treated as audacious, as if knowing what you're worth too early is a breach of etiquette. The irony is that the system teaches athletes to bet on themselves constantly, but only in ways that don't threaten existing hierarchies. The reaction also reveals how rare it is for players to prioritize self-respect over optics. Saying yes is safe, it's praised as humility. Saying no invites interpretation. People start asking what you think you deserve, who you think you are, whether you've earned it. But those questions are never asked of the system itself. No one asks whether the model has earned unquestioned loyalty. No one interrogates why deference is expected by default. Confidence becomes controversial when it removes access to leverage others feel entitled to control. When Shedeur refused to be rushed, refused to shrink his vision to match a predefined role, it unsettled people who rely on predictability. Not because his decision was loud, but because it was calm. Calm confidence leaves no room for dismissal. It forces honest evaluation. There's also a deeper cultural undercurrent at play. The way confidence is perceived isn't neutral, it's filtered through expectations about how athletes should behave, speak, and negotiate. When someone steps outside those expectations, especially without asking permission, the reaction tends to harden quickly.
Words like diva or entitled are rarely about behavior alone. They're about discomfort with autonomy that can't be easily managed. What's telling is that the criticism didn't center on mistakes, it centered on tone, on posture, on whether Shedeur should just focus on football, as if thinking beyond football disqualifies someone from taking it seriously, as if strategic awareness somehow undermines athletic commitment. In reality, it's the opposite. Understanding your environment deeply enough to make informed choices is a sign of professionalism, not distraction. So when confidence suddenly became arrogance, it wasn't because Shedeur changed, it was because the context did. His belief in his value crossed an invisible line where it stopped being inspirational and started being inconvenient. And inconvenience is often the first response to disruption. This isn't about attitude, it's about agency. And whenever agency shows up early, unapologetic and informed, the labels change fast. Not because the confidence is misplaced, but because it's no longer controllable. What the league never wanted wasn't one player saying no, it was the possibility of that no becoming repeatable. Systems can survive exceptions, they can't survive templates. In which Shedeur created, intentionally or not, was a visible pattern that others could study, adapt, and follow. That's the real threat, not rebellion, but replication. For decades, the NFL has relied on predictability. Rookies come in eager, they sign what's in front of them, they accept limited power early in exchange for the promise of future upside. That predictability isn't accidental, it's foundational. It allows the league to forecast costs, manage narratives, and maintain leverage at the most vulnerable point in a player's career. But predictability only works if players believe there's no alternative. Shedeur's move cracked that illusion, because once one highly visible athlete shows that entry is optional, not mandatory, it forces a recalculation behind closed doors. Front offices can dismiss outliers, they can't dismiss trends. And the most dangerous part of this wasn't the decision itself, it was how calmly it was made. There was no desperation, no public bargaining, no retreat, just a demonstration that leverage exists before the league gets involved.
That's the kind of precedent institutions hate because it spreads quietly. High school prospects see it. College athletes talk about it. Agents start fielding different questions. Instead of, how fast can I get drafted? It becomes, what happens if I wait? Instead of, what's the first deal? It becomes, what does this cost me long term? Those questions alone shift power, because they assume choice, and once choice is normalized, control weakens. What also makes this moment dangerous for the league is that it didn't require extraordinary circumstances. Shedeur didn't need a lockout. He didn't need a rule change. He didn't need collective action. He just used existing systems differently. NIL, private partnerships, personal platforms, tools that already exist. That's what makes this replicable. He didn't break the rules. He exposed how flexible they already were for anyone prepared enough to use them. Precedent doesn't need to be copied exactly to be effective. Most players won't walk the same path, they won't have the same visibility or resources. But that's not the point. The point is that the old fear narrative loses its grip. The idea that delaying entry equals career suicide starts to sound exaggerated. And once fear stops being the main motivator, negotiations get harder for the institution holding the standard offer. This also reframes the league's role. Instead of being the unavoidable destination, it becomes one option among several, still powerful, still valuable, but no longer absolute. That subtle downgrade in status is massive because it means the league has to start competing for talent in ways it never had to before, competing not just on money, but on flexibility, respect, and long-term alignment. The reason this precedent unsettles executives isn't because it threatens chaos overnight, it threatens slow erosion. One thoughtful pause here, one delayed entry there, one player asking for more structure, more say, more ownership. Over time, the system has to respond, either by adapting or by pretending the shift isn't happening until it's too big to ignore. And that's why this moment matters beyond headlines. It signals that the conversation has moved from "can a player do this?" to "what happens if more players do?" That's not a hypothetical the league enjoys entertaining, because once enough athletes stop treating the draft as the only door worth opening, the balance of power changes quietly, then all at once. Shedeur didn't force that reckoning, he just made it visible, and visibility is how precedents turn into pressure. The debate keeps circling the wrong question. People want to know whether this will work out, whether the gamble pays off, whether the stats will eventually justify the choice, but that framing misses what already happened. The outcome isn't hypothetical, it's here. The win wasn't a contract, a stat line, or a prediction about the future. The win was leverage. Leverage is what allows choice without panic. It's what turns offers into conversations instead of ultimatums. And once an athlete reaches that point, their career stops being something that happens to them and starts being something they direct. That's the shift people are reacting to, whether they realize it or not. Because if leverage exists before entry, the old gatekeeping logic collapses. Waiting stops being obedience, saying no stops being reckless, and timing becomes strategic instead of submissive. What Shedeur showed isn't that everyone should do the same thing, it's that the system only works as long as players believe they have no alternatives. The moment that belief fades, power redistributes, quietly at first, then visibly. And the most uncomfortable truth for institutions is that
nothing was taken from them. They weren't cheated, they weren't undermined. Someone simply used the rules differently and benefited. This isn't about escaping football, it's about refusing to let football be the only definition of success. Leverage means you don't have to rush. It means you don't have to trade control for validation. It means you can walk into negotiations already whole, not hoping to become whole later. That kind of positioning doesn't depend on touchdowns or timelines. It depends on awareness. Whether the next chapter unfolds exactly as planned is almost beside the point. The conversation has already shifted. Rookies will ask different questions now. Agents will prepare differently. Brands will approach earlier. Leagues will feel pressure in places they didn't expect, not because of rebellion, but because of example. Because once someone demonstrates that freedom is possible, compliance stops feeling inevitable. In the end, leverage doesn't guarantee outcomes, it guarantees options. And options are the one thing the old model was never built to allow at the beginning. That's why this moment matters, not because of who said no, but because of how calmly it was said. Because calm signals confidence, and confidence backed by leverage is something systems always struggle to contain. So no matter how the future unfolds, one thing is already settled. This wasn't about proving worth to anyone else, it was about refusing to let worth be defined too early. And in a system that thrives on urgency and silence, choosing leverage over speed is its own kind of victory.